Sure. Hello, and greetings to all of you from the Religious Studies faculty here at Holy Family University. As many of you know, because I had many of you in class a number of years ago, I'm Father Mark, and
I am Alex Hwang, or Dr. Hwang.
great. We're here to offer a theological reflection on the action of influence. To influence or being influenced, and doing so from a theological perspective. And as a result, what Dr. Hwang and I will be doing is drawing on some of what you've already been exposed to in the various religious studies courses in general education, world religions, introduction to the Hebrew scriptures, introduction to the four gospels, basics of the Catholic faith. And for those in the honors program, honors world religions and honors Jesus the Christ. So perhaps going back a little bit in time, a number of semesters ago to when you had these courses, we'll draw on that as we begin exploring from a theological perspective, this topic of influence. So Dr. Hwang, what do you think would be a good starting point?
Well, I think a good starting point would be the actual root and origin of the word, which I think you did some work on, where the word itself comes from.
And particularly for those of you who've had intro to the Hebrew scriptures and intro to the four gospels, you know how important some of these words are in their original context. And the word influence, as we use it in English, comes to us from Latin, a Latin verb, influo, which interestingly has as its context the movement of water, and generally a movement of water from a larger body to a smaller body in a gentle way so as to provide irrigation of the land and also to provide drinking water for people, for animals, and plants. So some of you may recall some of this discussion of the context of the ancient Near Eastern world, that rich topic of salvation, Yeshua, having all of the minimal necessities for living, of which water was always the first, because nothing else is going to exist without water. So in its linguistic context and historical context, this has a lot to do with movement. In this case, movement of water, which is a necessity for life, to be engaged in some action that has as its bottom line effect life or the enhancement of life.
You mentioned before about, in our previous conversations, about the influence and in the macro context of the Trinity, and how influence has to do with water and how it's essential to being alive, and maybe speak to how what is so essential to us comes from somewhere, and ultimately what that source is.
Okay. Yeah. Again, influence has built into it this sense of movement. And in many of the religious traditions, and you bring up the Trinity, so particularly in terms of Christianity, there is always this movement of God from self to other, which Christianity names as agape. Christianity names that as love, this movement from God to other, that is always done with the intention of willing the good of the other, which is going to involve, by definition, some type of sacrifice on self. To be involved in this movement of agape, to be involved in this movement of love, does require, by its very being, sacrifice on one's part, which gets us into what many of the world's religious traditions will value as some type of conversion, some type of fasting, some type of saying no to self for the good of the other. And again, it ties in very well with that original context historically of the Latin verb, that this is always being done for some type of essential aspect of living.
You bring up a really good point about influence as being rather neutral. It could be for both good, and it could also be for bad. And I think you've provided us a way of looking at and how to evaluate what a good influence is as opposed to a bad influence. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, a good influence is about the spreading and the flourishing of love. Mm-hmm. And whereas, so it becomes very clear what a good influence is in your life and what a bad influence is in your life. And that could apply both to drugs that could help you. And we know how drugs can be medicinal and even salvific for some and for many, and how it could be destructive and deadly if not properly used. So the influence could be both for good and for bad. And the influence of others upon oneself could be both good. And we are influenced by our relationships with other people. And we are in relationships that are both have good influences in our lives and bad influences in our lives. And we could recognize those two, yet somehow, Father Mark, we know that when given this logical choice of avoiding those bad influences, why do we always somehow choose the bad? Why are we so prone to bad influences?
Well, from a theological point of view, the response is quite clear. It's what many of the religious traditions term original sin. Now, granted, not all traditions will use that term, but the vast majority of religious traditions on the face of the earth recognize that there is some fundamental flaw within human nature, some fundamental flaw within creation that is not of divine origin. Those wonderful examples you just brought up a moment ago of influences that can be good or not so good. I can't help but think right now your home state dealing with these devastating floods. You were talking earlier before we began recording of the devastation, and particularly the severity of the devastation among the poor of Eastern Kentucky. In terms of the Hebrew scriptures, they saw that water, again, building on your previous examples, of a single element having the potential for both good and not so good. Throughout the pages of the Hebrew scriptures, they recognize water is an absolute necessity. Mm-hmm. But if that water is not in balance, too little, in other words, a drought, we die. Too much, flood, we die. So I know this gets at something of balance. This act of influencing, even from a theological point of view, is also part of a balancing act that I know you had brought up earlier when we were prepping this presentation, and perhaps a word or two that you had mentioned about balance might be good, might be helpful here.
Yeah, I think with anything, when taken to extremes, it could be rather destructive.
Mm.
And when we look at especially Eastern religions and Eastern philosophy, there's always this need for balance because it understands that human beings are a result of different elements, different competing elements. And so the problem in life is when those things are out of balance. And so it's important to understand that there are influences that are neither good or bad, but in those extremes, it can be good or bad, and especially bad. And so the need for balance is especially important in Eastern philosophy. Balance, of course, is absolutely necessary in one's individual life. One can't live without balance, physically, but also emotionally.
Do you see any connection between balance and agape?
Well, that's a hard one. That's a hard one to think about. What do you think?
Well, I tossed it out because that might be something worth for the group that we're addressing, might be worth considering. Because if we talk about agape as a movement, a flowing down in fluo, it involves the sacrifice of self. How far does that sacrifice go, though? Yeah, that's why I tossed the question out. It's a tough one. We look at some of the folks from the various episodes in the Hebrew Scriptures where they sacrifice much of themselves. Think about the person Abraham, common to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. A man that stands in those monotheistic traditions as the father of faith, principally because of his sacrificial approach to following wholeheartedly what he is asked to do. Certainly from the Christian perspective, the person Jesus Christ gives the model of sacrifice, which is a tough one because it's total and complete. And I think that's where we get into the paradox that many of the religious traditions will bring to the forefront and attempt to help us to live out that paradox that in losing, we gain. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily in a quid pro quo, not necessarily in terms of an Excel balance sheet that, okay, I do this, I get that. But especially when it comes to these essentials for the living of life, which for human beings is going to involve agape as it is lived out relationally among fellow human beings in communion with their God. And that lesson of actually gaining through losing, that's not necessarily orchestrated by myself, that I simply go into this to give genuinely and generously, and what happens, happens. I don't know if that responds to your question.
Yeah. You mentioned something earlier that made me pause a bit about how that there is an acknowledgement in almost all religions that there's something fundamentally wrong with the human condition, with the human person. And we know that that's actually validated by the sciences. The fact that we are so prone to disease. We are so susceptible to weakness, to viruses. I mean, right now, I mean, we're in the midst of this terrible pandemic.
Right.
I mean, so vulnerable we are, I mean, the need for plastic surgery, so something deeply wrong with our sense of our thinking of our lack of perfection. Somehow thinking that we are incomplete as a society, in general, multi-billion-dollar cosmetic industry, plastic surgery, okay? Somehow that there, and then we have the perhaps trillion-dollar pharmaceutical industry that tells us that there is something deeply wrong with us in our psyche. And so I think you mentioned something that was deeply true about what it means to be a human being. And what it means to be a human being is to be deeply flawed, that there's something wrong with us. And why is it that we do the things that we do? Right? And you mentioned the Christian answer, the Judeo-Christian Islamic answer is the fact that we are created in the image of God, but that we are deeply flawed.
Right.
And that we are responsible for this, not God.
Exactly.
And other religions also have the same understanding of it as well, and also puts the same responsibility on the human beings. And I'm talking about karma and all the religions that believe in karma.
Mm-hmm.
That yes, we are deeply flawed. It's because of the result of the fact that we have led terrible lives in the past, and we still can't get rid of this terrible behavior, this terrible innate behavior. Mm-hmm. that is something deeply wrong with us. Okay, and therefore we already have this terrible influence upon our lives already from the moment we are born. And if you don't believe in the doctrine of original sin, all you have to do is look at a baby. And you will see, yes, we are born selfish. Okay, that's our natural, that is what is now our natural nature. Yeah.
Maybe, Dr. Hwang, maybe you could just leave us with a couple of key points that maybe the group would want to discuss once we're finished.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you, Father Mark. This has been a really great conversation to have, and something that we will continue with. But some of the key things that I am taking away from this, and hopefully I will continue to reflect on and think about, is the idea of influence in one's personal life, but also the influence on a macro level. How much of our influence is outside of us, as how much of it is free will, how much of it has been determined, and also the neutral quality of influence, that influence can be both for the good and for the evil. And we know this with such things as drugs, that they could be a very positive influence, but also a very negative influence in certain cases. And also with relationships that we have with other people, they could be a great source of good influence and also a bad influence. And we know that. And the reasons why, perhaps, why we choose the bad influence and why we don't has to do with our own nature and who we are and why we do the things that we do. Right? What influences us? So I think that's about it.
Okay. Well, how about we close with, this is a blessing prayer that I use to close all of my classes. It's the blessing that Aaron pronounced over the Israelites. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord let his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord look upon you kindly and give you peace today and all the days of your life. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Dr. Hwang. This has been a delightful conversation. Thank you to the students assembled here and your professor for listening to us. And Dr. Hwang, any concluding?
Well, thank you for this time. Yes, enjoyed this conversation.